middle of the night. You're asleep when the ground starts shaking. There's a sound outside, loud, crashing, heavy, something massive, something you can't see clearly in the dark. In that moment, it doesn't feel like wildlife. It feels like a monster. Now imagine someone you care about, a neighbor, a friend, maybe your mom or your dad, goes outside to check and doesn't ever come back. For many communities living alongside wildlife in Tanzania, that fear isn't imagination. That monster is a 6,000-pound elephant making its way through farmland in the dark. When I was in Tanzania this past summer, I met someone named Zara. Zara was a part of a local elephant response team and worked with the Tanzanian Elephant Foundation. When elephants came into her village, she would go out with a noisemaker and a flashlight, trying to redirect animals that outweighed her by thousands of pounds. 2 weeks after I returned home from Tanzania, Zara was trampled and killed by an elephant. Knowing this, you can see how fear makes complete sense. Elephants can destroy a season's harvest in a matter of minutes. And in these communities, crops aren't decorative. They're food, income, school fees, security. When something that large moves through your land, uninvited and unstoppable, your nervous system doesn't think about biodiversity or conservation. It registers threat. And when that threat repeats itself over and over, night after night, that fear turns into exhaustion, and that exhaustion turns into resentment. Not because people hate elephants. What struck me most in Tanzania was actually quite the opposite. There's admiration, respect, cultural pride. But admiration doesn't replace a lost harvest. Respect doesn't feed a family. When communities feel abandoned in that fear, harming wildlife begins to feel less like cruelty and more like survival. You can see how if a poacher were to show up and offer to pay you to kill the same animals that had been destroying your livelihood, it could sound like a reasonable deal. That is how poaching becomes normalized, not out of hatred, but out of desperation. If we want to stop it, we cannot simply punish our way out of it. Arresting poachers after the fact is a reaction. If we truly want to fix it, we need to think about prevention. But what if I've told you that everything I've just said is only half of the story? Now, let's flip the script. You are the largest land mammal, the matriarch of your herd. You weigh 6,000 pounds. You walk migration routes that your family has followed for generations, ancient paths worn into the ground long before human borders existed. You can push over trees with little effort. You walk miles and miles in a single day. But suddenly, your stomach starts to grumble. You're hungry. Your job is to find food for your family. You could graze on the nutrient-poor vegetation scattered across miles of landscape, or you could follow a smell. Suddenly, in front of you are rows of dense, nutritious crops. Abundant, accessible, far better than anything the wild landscape is offering, lined up for you like a buffet. And so you help yourself, and boy, is it delicious. But then, all of a sudden, lights start flashing, voices erupt, humans come running at you, making noises, shouting, screaming, things you don't understand. From your perspective, you weren't doing anything wrong. You were hungry. You found food. But now you're surrounded by chaos, lights in your eyes, noises from every direction. Your nervous system does exactly what it's designed to do. It panics. You feel like you're under attack. You don't see farm. You don't see where national park ends and private land begins. You don't see property lines or invisible boundaries. You were hungry, you found food, and somehow that made you the villain. So here's what I want you to hold on to. Zara wasn't doing anything wrong. She was protecting her community. And the elephant wasn't doing anything wrong either. She was hungry, she found food, and she was providing for her family like any good matriarch would. Two beings, both doing exactly what they believed they had to do to protect their communities, and yet the result was tragedy. That's what human-wildlife conflict really is. It's not malice on either side. It's two survival instincts colliding in the same space with no shared language and no system designed to prevent that collision. The real tension is that we drew invisible lines and expected elephants to respect borders they cannot possibly perceive. We speak one language and they speak another. And when those two languages collide, we call it conflict. What we rarely call it is what it actually is: a failure of design. We designed a world that put elephants and humans in each other's way and then acted surprised when they ended up in conflict. We responded reactively with fences, with forces, with people running into the dark. But what if we got ahead of it? What if, instead of reacting after the fact, we prevented that collision from happening at all? That shift from reactive to proactive is what the heart of modern conservation needs to become. And it all starts with a deceptively simple question. What if, instead of trying to overpower animals, we spoke a language they already understand? In 2010, conservation biologist Lucy King discovered something remarkable. Elephants are afraid of bees. A sting near the eyes or inside the trunk is painful. But what's even more amazing is that elephants don't just fear the sting themselves. They learn to associate the sound of the bees with danger. So the next time they're near a hive and they hear those bees, they don't wait around to get stung. They turn around and walk the other way. And from that insight came the beehive fence. The beehive fence is a series of active hives connected by wire between concrete poles. They're all strung with taut wire around the perimeter of farmland. The wire itself is not meant to physically stop an elephant. It doesn't need to. When the elephant walks up to the fence, shakes it, that shake travels to the nearby hives. And when that hive shakes, it shakes the next hive in the path. All of the bees from those hives emerge. The elephant hears them, remembers exactly what that means, turns around, walks away. No gunshots, no confrontation, nobody running into the dark. The elephant understands immediately, not because it was punished, but because the system spoke a language it understands. But something else grows from these fences. A higher presence of bees means a higher presence of pollinators for the surrounding crops, the same crops that were initially being destroyed. The hives also generate honey that can be harvested and sold. What was once defensive becomes generative. The same animals that were once a source of fear become a part of the system of support for the community. The threat becomes the resource, and the smallest creature, a honeybee, becomes the bridge between those two worlds. But this is just one example of what happens when we stop reacting and start designing. Around the world, conservationists are creating wildlife migration corridors, which are specially made corridors that allow animals to pass over freeways completely so that they are not forced through human settlements or cars and can still follow along their typical migration routes. There are nutrient corridors, which are specially maintained landscapes that keep animals moving and well-fed through the land so that they can reduce the pull on specific nearby farmland. And there are early warning systems using GPS collaring that allow villages to be alerted before the animals arrive so that they can plan and prepare instead of just react. Not only do these systems built to work with animal behavior tend to work better, but they also are often cheaper. What all of these solutions share is a fundamental mindset shift. Instead of asking, how do we stop animals from doing what they naturally do? They ask, how do we design a world in which what animals naturally do doesn't have to conflict with humans? And that requires us to understand animal behavior. It requires us to understand where they move, what they eat, what they fear, what they understand. It requires us to care about animals even when they don't look like us, even when they aren't charismatic or cuddly, even when they're a 6,000-pound elephant that just destroyed someone's livelihood. Because understanding is not the same as excusing. Understanding is the prerequisite to designing something that actually works. And elephants are just one example of this. Across the world, wildlife and humans are sharing shrinking landscapes. As habitats fragment and populations grow, these encounters will increase. Wolves and livestock, coyotes killing your neighbor's cat, bears sneaking into your backyard to eat your koi fish. In every case, it's the same pattern. 2 survival instincts, 1 space, no shared language, no system designed to prevent the collision. The future of conservation will not be decided only in research papers or policy debates. It'll be decided in villages, in fields, in the everyday spaces where humans and wildlife interact. So the question is, are we going to keep reacting, or are we going to start designing? When I think about Zara, I think about someone who stood in that space between humans and wildlife and tried desperately to protect both. With a flashlight and noisemaker and extraordinary courage. And I think about how urgently we need a system that doesn't require that kind of sacrifice in the first place. A system built not on force, but on listening, on understanding what each side needs and designing at that intersection before collision happens. A beehive fence doesn't shout, it doesn't threaten, it hums. And that hum, barely audible, produced by a creature that weighs less than a gram, is enough to stop a 6,000-pound elephant in its tracks. Not because it overpowers it, but because it understands it. And that's the lesson, not just for conservation, but for every space where 2 parties are speaking different languages and calling the silence between them conflict. The bees protecting the elephants are not just a clever story. They're a blueprint. They remind us that power does not equal force, that size doesn't determine impact, and that sometimes the most effective solution is the one that listens to the intelligence of nature instead of trying to overpower it. If we want a future where both humans and wildlife thrive, we must design for coexistence. And sometimes that begins by listening close enough to realize that the smallest voice, the hum of a honeybee, is enough to change everything. Thank you.